There is a kind of evil that does not arrive with a warning. It does not come with fangs or flames. It comes on letterhead, with a signature at the bottom of a form, with a work meeting where one man draws a rectangle on a map and another nods from the other side of the table. The greatest evil in modern history was not an irrational outburst, nor a moment of collective fury that no one managed to stop. It was a project with deadlines, budgets, architects, engineers, contractors, and follow-up meetings. A project conceived in orderly offices, with coffee served in porcelain cups, while outside the world kept moving as if nothing were happening. Think about what it takes to build something capable of killing 1 million people. Not a weapon, not a battlefield where death comes in the chaos of a single moment. Something different, a permanent installation, planned and designed specifically to turn slaughter into routine, to make extermination operate with the same efficiency as a factory, with shifts, protocols, and performance indicators, to make it happen day after day, without interruption, without those who operated it mentally breaking under the weight of what they were doing, because what they were doing no longer looked like extermination, but like administration. Someone had to draw the plans. Someone had to calculate the dimensions of the chambers. Someone had to sign the contracts with the companies that built the furnaces. Someone had to decide what kind of ventilation system to install, what kind of door would guarantee an airtight seal, how many pellets would be enough to kill 800 people in 20 minutes. Someone made all of those calculations, wrote them down on paper, filed them away, and in many cases went home that night to have dinner with his family. This is the story of how Auschwitz was built, not as an anecdote, not as a catalogue of horrors, but as a precise analysis of a system, its decisions, its men in charge, its mechanisms. Because understanding how it was built is the only way to understand how it functioned, and understanding how it functioned is the only way to understand that this did not fall from the sky. People did this. People who chose to do it, step by step. The project of death, how Auschwitz was designed for extermination. Before it was Auschwitz, it was Auschwitz I, a small town in southern Poland, nestled between the Sola and Vistula rivers, surrounded by flat plains that, filled with dampness in spring and in winter, were covered by a persistent fog that took hours to lift. A town with a market, with synagogues, with a Jewish community that had lived there for centuries, with taverns, shops, and families who knew every street by its Polish name and every neighbor by his story. An ordinary town with no particular reason to exist in the memory of the world. On the outskirts of that town, the Austro-Hungarian army had built a complex of brick barracks during the First World War. 22 functional buildings without any pretension, arranged with military rectangular logic and surrounded by an old perimeter wall. When the empire dissolved and Poland regained its independence, the Polish army used those facilities. When Poland fell under the German invasion in September 1939, the barracks were left empty once again, waiting like a stage without a play. The invasion of Poland was not only a military conquest, it was the beginning of a deliberate policy to destroy the Polish nation. The Germans quickly identified those they considered the heads of potential resistance: university professors, doctors, lawyers, priests, officers, teachers, intellectuals of any kind. They arrested them by the thousands. But arresting thousands required space to contain them, and the prisons of Silesia had been operating at the limit of their capacity for months. The bureaucratic solution was obvious: a new camp. In January 1940, SS Hauptsturmführer Arpad Wigand, deputy to the higher SS and police leader for Silesia, submitted a concrete proposal. The abandoned barracks at Auschwitz I met the necessary conditions. They were relatively isolated, had railway access, basic infrastructure, and the pre-existing perimeter wall reduced the cost of conversion. Richard Glucks, head of the Nazi concentration camp inspectorate, sent Walter Eisfeld, former commandant of Sachsenhausen, to evaluate the site in person. Eisfeld inspected the buildings, measured the perimeters, calculated the potential capacity, and delivered his report. The verdict was favorable. On the 27th of April 1940, Heinrich Himmler approved the creation of the camp, and in that same act, he chose the man who would command it. Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss was 38 years old when he received the appointment. He had been born in Baden-Baden on the 25th of November 1901, the son of a devout Catholic merchant who had dreamed that his son would become a priest. Life did not follow that path. At 15, he had enlisted in the Kaiser's army. He fought in the First World War, on the Middle Eastern Front. And when he returned to Germany, he came back to a republic that, in his eyes, was a humiliation, a defeated and fragmented country where the order he had once known no longer existed. During the Weimar years, Höss drifted toward far-right paramilitary movements. He took part in one of the so-called Fememorde, the extrajudicial killings that ultra-nationalist organizations carried out against those they considered traitors to the nation. He was tried, sentenced to 10 years in prison, and released early in 1928 under an amnesty. He did not feel he had done anything wrong. He felt that the system which had convicted him was the wrong system. In 1934, Himmler recruited him into the SS. Höss began at Dachau under Theodor Eicke, the architect of the Nazi concentration camp system. There he learned the language of institutionalized violence. The regulations, the punishments, the hierarchy, the necessary distance between guard and prisoner so the guard could continue doing his job without breaking. He later moved to Sachsenhausen, where he rose through the ranks. When Himmler appointed him commandant of Auschwitz, Höss was exactly the kind of man the regime needed for the task. Disciplined, loyal, competent in managing violence, capable of seeing a system where others would have seen only suffering. Höss arrived in Auschwitz I in May 1940 with the explicit mission of building the camp. And he did so with the method of someone who had learned that systems are built from details. He moved in with his wife Hedwig and their 5 children in a 2-story house attached to the commandant's office, less than 100 meters from the perimeter he himself was designing. From the upstairs windows, he could see the roofs of the barracks. From the garden where his children played in the afternoons, he could hear, if the wind was right, the noise coming from the other side of the wall. That proximity did not disturb him. It was part of his mental framework. The camp was work, the house was home, and the two things could coexist without one contaminating the other. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate what one does from what one is one of the most disturbing traits of Holocaust perpetrators. They were not monsters who took pleasure in pain. In many cases, they were men who had learned not to feel the pain of others as something real, because the system had taught them that those others were not quite equal to them. The first 30 prisoners arrived on the 20th of May 1940, transferred from Sachsenhausen. They were German common criminals selected specifically for one function, to establish the camp's internal hierarchy. They were called Grüne, the Greens, after the green triangle sewn onto their uniforms that identified common criminals within the Nazi marking system. At their head, a man named Bruno Brodnowitz was appointed Lagerältester, the camp elder, the highest-ranking prisoner in the internal chain. The others were appointed capos and barracks chiefs. That system, the delegation of immediate surveillance to prisoners turned into supervisors over other prisoners, was one of the most effective innovations of the Nazi camp model. It created an intermediate layer of control that saved SS manpower, fractured solidarity among inmates, and generated an internal hierarchy in which some prisoners had concrete incentives to maintain order because their relatively privileged position depended on it. The capos of the first months were common criminals with experience in the German prison system. Many established from the first day a culture of brutality directed specifically against the Polish prisoners who began to arrive. On the 14th of June 1940, the first mass transport arrived. 728 Polish political prisoners from the city of Tarnow, arrested as part of an operation called Intelligenzaktion, the systematic plan to eliminate the Polish elites. Among them were university professors, lawyers, doctors, Catholic priests, and several Jews. They were unloaded at the camp, registered with numbers 31 to 758, and issued striped uniforms. June 14 was inscribed as the foundational date of the camp in the records of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum itself. What happened in the following months was the installation of a system. And systems have their own logic. They expand wherever they encounter the least resistance. They optimize themselves in the direction set by their central purpose. Auschwitz's purpose in its first months was to contain and degrade. The deaths that occurred were not yet planned as state policy. They were the foreseeable result of conditions designed so the body could not sustain itself. Hunger, cold, exhausting labor, blows from the capos, diseases spreading without real medical care. Death was the natural consequence of all that, and that was intentional enough. The prisoners built the camp that imprisoned them. With their own hands, In 11-hour workdays, they added second floors to the existing barracks, installed the electrified fences, strung the barbed wire, expanded drainage systems, built internal roads. There is a particular cruelty in that. Forcing someone to build his own cage, to contribute his energy, draining day by day, to the infrastructure of his own suffering. Historians who later examined the preserved brick barracks could identify precisely where the original construction ended and where the prisoners' additions began. An almost visible line in the brickwork where before and after touched. The identification system was designed with the characteristic precision of Nazi bureaucracy. Upon arrival, prisoners had their heads shaved, were disinfected, assigned a number, and given a uniform. On the jacket, just below the number, they wore a cloth triangle whose color indicated the category. Red for political prisoners, green for common criminals, black for the asocials, a category that ranged from vagrants to prostitutes and Roma, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for homosexuals. Jews wore a yellow Star of David formed by two overlapping triangles, with a letter indicating their country of origin. Auschwitz was the only camp where prisoners were tattooed. The number was engraved on the left forearm with blue pelican ink, a company that continued to exist after the war as a commercial brand. The tattooing system was developed from 1941 onward in response to a practical problem. Bodies deteriorated so quickly and in such numbers that it was no longer possible to identify them by the number sewn onto the uniform once the clothing had been destroyed. The number on the skin remained legible when the body was already unrecognizable. That apparently technical decision, to tattoo rather than label, reveals something about the system's mentality. Prisoners were treated like inventory objects that could deteriorate, and the solution to deterioration was to engrave the identification into the material itself, into the skin, so that the inventory remained traceable even after the object had degraded. It was warehouse logic applied to human beings. By March 1941, the number of registered prisoners in Auschwitz had reached 10,900. Most were Poles. But something was changing in the regime's plans. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The first weeks produced massive captures of Soviet prisoners of war that the existing camp system had no capacity to absorb. And in the highest circles of Nazi power, conversations about the Jewish question were evolving from expulsion and persecution into something radically different. Something that required facilities on a scale the world had never built before. In August 1941, Himmler visited Auschwitz. What he saw confirmed for him that the existing camp was an instrument too small for the purposes the regime now had in mind. Hess received direct instructions. Expansion was necessary. Something new had to be built. Something of a different magnitude, and more efficient methods had to be explored for what the regime's language euphemistically called the final solution to the Jewish question. That same summer, in the basement of Block 11, an experiment took place that would change the history of mass death. Zyklon B did not arrive at Auschwitz as a weapon, it arrived as a pesticide. It was an industrial pesticide developed in the first half of the 20th century from prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide. It was manufactured in the form of small, bluish crystals, or pellets impregnated with the active compound, designed to be poured into enclosed spaces where, upon contact with air, evaporation would kill insects and parasites. The company that produced it, Dagesh, a subsidiary of the powerful IG Farben conglomerate, supplied it routinely to concentration camps for the disinfection of clothing and blankets. During Auschwitz's first months, Zyklon B was stored on the second floor of Block 3 and used in the disinfection chambers where prisoners' uniforms were treated to eliminate the lice that inevitably proliferated in the camp's overcrowding. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch was the camp's deputy commandant. At some point during the summer of 1941, historical sources do not specify the exact month, though scholarly consensus places it in August. Fritsch made a decision that appeared in no manual and no written order. He had a group of Soviet prisoners of war taken down to the basement of Block 11 and the doors sealed. He then introduced Zyklon B crystals through the upper openings and waited. The experiment was imperfect. The gas concentration, the compartmentalized space, and the ventilation conditions were not adequate for the result he was seeking. The prisoners took longer to die than expected. Some did not die immediately and had to be killed by other means. Fritsch took note. The dosage was the problem. The space was as well. The second experiment was different. It was planned more carefully and took place between September 3 and 5, 1941. This time the subjects were moved to the crematorium building, which until then had served exclusively for the incineration of prisoners who had died from other causes. Around 850 people in total, mostly Soviet prisoners of war, and a group of sick Polish prisoners selected from the camp hospital. They were told they would receive new clothing. They were instructed to undress before entering. The doors were shut, the lights were turned off, and Zyklon B was introduced from outside. This time it worked. Höss later described, in the memoirs he wrote during his captivity before execution, that he felt something close to relief when he discovered this method. Not the relief of someone who enjoyed death, but the relief of someone who had been worried about a logistical problem and had found its solution. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads operating on the Eastern Front, were carrying out mass shootings. Höss had seen how that method morally broke the executioners, how soldiers returned from the mass graves with something shattered inside them. Gas, he argued in his writings, created distance. The operators did not see those who were dying. They did not hear exactly what was happening on the other side of the airtight doors. They simply poured in the crystals and waited. It was cleaner, more manageable, more sustainable as a system. This rationalization, presenting mass murder as a technical solution to a psychological welfare problem for the murderers, says something essential about how the regime thought about all of this. Extermination was not an aberration that embarrassed its architects. It was a project that had to be optimized. On the 20th of January 1942, in a 3-story villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 high-ranking officials of the Nazi government and the SS met for approximately 90 minutes. The meeting had been convened by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office. The purpose was not to debate whether Europe's Jews should be exterminated. That decision had already been taken at the highest levels of the regime. The purpose was to coordinate the logistics of how to do it. Who had jurisdiction over which territories, how transport would be organized, how the labor of those able to work before dying would be managed, how cooperation between the different branches of the state would be structured. Adolf Eichmann, who took the notes and drafted the meeting protocol, used throughout the session the euphemistic language the regime had perfected to speak about what it was doing without naming it directly. Evacuation, resettlement, final solution. The words floated over the table with administrative calm. What they described was the planned murder of 11 million people, the number the participants had calculated as the total Jewish population of Europe. Auschwitz was going to be the axis of that project. And to become that, it had to be transformed into something qualitatively different from what it had been up to then. The construction of Auschwitz-Birkenau began in October 1941, even before the Wannsee Conference formally codified the extermination project. The decision to expand the complex had been taken months earlier, during Himmler's visit. The place chosen lay 3 kilometers from the main camp, in a village called Brzezinka, whose German name, Birkenau, means birch forest. 7 villages were erased to make room for the new complex. Their Polish inhabitants were expelled, their homes demolished, or converted into camp facilities. The memory of those villages, of the life that had existed there before, was erased with the same indifference with which land is leveled to poor foundations. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, SS architect and head of the Auschwitz Construction Authority, oversaw the design of the new camp. Bischoff was a competent professional. His office, established on the 1st of October 1941, employed SS engineers and architects alongside prisoners with technical training who were forced to contribute to the planning of their own enlarged prison. Bischoff's files, which the Nazis forgot to destroy when they burned the camp's main documents in the days before liberation, survived the war and became one of the most revealing documentary collections on the bureaucracy of extermination. Among those documents, the blueprint of the complete Birkenau camp, dated the 14th of October 1941. The barracks plans signed by Bischoff himself. The initial budget of 8.9 million Reichsmarks, soon deemed insufficient. The successive capacity revisions. First 97,000 prisoners, then 125,000, then more. The records of meetings where, in neutral technical language, they discussed material resistance, drainage systems, smoke evacuation capacity, chamber dimensions. Paper upon paper, signature upon signature, an orderly archive of the planning of the largest mass extermination in history. The Birkenau barracks were not the brick buildings of Auschwitz I. Many were uniform-looking wooden structures originally designed as stables for the German army's horses. Each measured 35 meters long by 11 wide, divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters. Each compartment was subdivided into 3-tiered wooden platforms on which prisoners slept, originally designed for 3 people and expanded to 4 when pressure demanded it. They were repurposed stables with no consideration whatsoever for the needs of the human body, because the human body was not the design criterion. The ground on which Birkenau was built was marshy. Alfred Czesław Przybylski, a Polish prisoner who worked on the construction, later testified that the choice of that damp terrain when dry ground was available nearby could not have been accidental. He was convinced that the marshland had been deliberately chosen to make living conditions even more lethal. The constant mud, the cold rising from the wet earth through the wooden platforms, the stagnant water favoring mosquitoes and disease. If that was the intention of those who chose the site, the result corresponded exactly to what had been planned. The first prisoners to live in Birkenau while building it were 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war, who arrived between October 7 and 25, 1941. They lived in unfinished buildings, on bare earth, without heating, on minimal rations, in the same mud they had to turn into foundations. By the 1st of March 1942, only 945 of them were still recorded. More than 9,000 had died in less than 5 months, consumed by cold, hunger, and disease in the camp they were building. That number, 9,000 people dead in 4 months before the camp was even functional, was the announcement of what Birkenau was going to be. It was not a place designed for prisoners to survive long enough to be useful. It was a place designed for prisoners to die at a rate the system could manage. But death by exhaustion, hunger, and disease was too slow for the purposes the regime had in mind. The industrial process of extermination required another infrastructure, and that infrastructure was being designed in parallel with the barracks. Crematoria 2 and 3 at Birkenau were planned from the outset as integrated installations for mass extermination. Each consisted of 3 articulated elements: an undressing room at underground level with numbered coat hooks on the walls, an adjacent gas chamber 30 meters long by 7 wide, and a furnace room on the upper level connected to the chamber by a system of elevators. The plans, signed by Bischoff and by engineers from the construction firm Topf und Söhne of Erfurt, document with millimetric precision every dimension, every mechanical system, every technical detail. Topf und Söhne was a company specializing in industrial furnaces. Its engineers had developed combustion systems for crematoria in several concentration camps. When Auschwitz required a cremation capacity on an unprecedented scale, the company responded with designs that optimized fuel consumption by loading multiple bodies into each furnace simultaneously. In the correspondence between Topf engineers and the SS at Auschwitz, preserved in part in the archives the Nazis failed to destroy, they discussed the efficiency of different grate models, the resistance of bricks to sustained high temperatures, the time required for cremating an adult body compared with that of a child. It is technical correspondence. It has the tone of an ordinary engineering project, and that is precisely what makes it unbearable. The 4 crematoria at Birkenau, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, were completed between 1942 and 1943. Their combined theoretical capacity was 4,416 bodies in 24 hours. In practice, the Sonderkommando operating the installations could reach nearly double that by loading the furnaces above their nominal capacity. The engineering of extermination had its own performance indicators, and those responsible monitored them. But before they reached the crematoria, the prisoners who were going to die first had to reach Auschwitz, and that required another system, the railway. The trains that carried Holocaust victims to Auschwitz came from all over occupied Europe, from Polish cities and ghettos where Jewish communities had been concentrated after the invasion, from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, from Greece, where the Jewish community of Salonika, one of the oldest in the Mediterranean with 500 years of history, was deported almost in its entirety, from Italy, from Norway, from Eastern Europe, and in the spring of 1944, from Hungary, in what became the fastest extermination period in Auschwitz's entire history. The wagons were freight cars, designed to carry goods or cattle, not people. Without seats, without useful windows, without sanitary facilities beyond a bucket placed in one corner. In the worst cases, overcrowding was such that the deportees could not sit. They remained standing for hours or days, pressed against the bodies of others, breathing air that was steadily running out. In summer, the heat could be deadly. In winter, the cold came through the wooden boards without any insulation. Journeys lasted days, sometimes more than a week, without guaranteed water, without sufficient food, with the bodies of those who died during the trip remaining in the wagon beside the survivors until the doors were opened. Many deportees had been told they were being resettled in territories in the east. They were going to work, they had been told. Their families would remain together. They were to bring the essentials, valuables, photographs, work tools. Many complied. The suitcases that would later be confiscated at Auschwitz had their owners' names carefully written on them, their birth dates, their cities of origin, marked for a reunion that would never take place. The lie was part of the system long before the first train arrived. Until May 1944, transports arrived at the so-called Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish ramp, an unloading platform located between Auschwitz I and Birkenau, 2.5 kilometers from the gas chambers. Deportees not selected for immediate labor had to walk that distance in columns. In May 1944, in order to handle the extraordinary volume of Hungarian transports, the railway spur that penetrated directly into the perimeter of Birkenau was completed. The trains entered through the arch of the main guard tower, rolled slowly along the internal tracks, and stopped just meters from the crematoria. The journey from train to death was now measured in meters, not kilometers. The selection process that took place on the platform was one of the most meticulously documented aspects of Auschwitz, not by the Germans, but by the survivors who lived through it, and by the visual records that exist. The Auschwitz album, a series of more than 200 photographs taken by the SS themselves during the Hungarian deportations of May and June 1944, is the most complete visual record of arrivals that exists. It shows entire families descending from the wagons, men in hats, women in coats, children holding hands, old people leaning on canes. It also shows the SS doctors lined up on the platform, pointing with their fingers in two directions. The selection criteria were codified, though their application depended in part on the officer on duty. In general terms, all children under 14 or 15 years old were sent directly to the gas chamber. To determine whether a child was too short, a stick was sometimes used at a fixed height. Those below it were sent to die. All women arriving with small children met the same fate, because having a child in one's arms indicated that the woman was not available for labor. All elderly people, all those showing visible signs of illness, injury, or incapacity. In practice, between 75 and 80% of those stepping off the trains were sent directly to the crematoria. They were not registered as prisoners. They received no number. For the camp's records, their existence began and ended on the platform. The doctor most associated with selections at Auschwitz was Joseph Mengele. He arrived at the camp on the 30th of May 1943, at age 32, with doctorates in medicine and anthropology from the University of Frankfurt. He was punctual, meticulous, well-dressed. He personally supervised train arrivals, especially from 1944 onward. The testimonies of multiple survivors are consistent in the details of his presence on the platform. The immaculate uniform, the white gloves at times, the riding crop in his hand, the calm he projected in the middle of the chaos of arrival. His specific interest was identical twins, dwarfs, and people with congenital physical anomalies. On the platform he could be heard announcing, "Zwillinge heraus," twins forward. According to testimony, his tone was almost that of someone handing out candy. The selected twins were not sent to the gas chamber immediately. They were taken to barracks 29 and 31 at Birkenau, where Mengele had established what he described as a scientific research program, and what was in reality a series of experiments that included blood transfusions between twins with different blood groups, surgeries without anesthesia, injections of pathogenic agents to study the course of diseases, and when one twin died, the execution of the other so that simultaneous autopsies could be performed and the results compared. Mengele took notes. He photographed. He archived data. He behaved as if he were doing science. He was not. The protocols he followed had no recognized scientific validity. The procedures could not be published or replicated. What he produced was not knowledge but documented suffering. But the pretense of scientific methodology served a purpose. It allowed him, and those around him, to frame what he was doing as something other than naked cruelty. In Block 10 of Auschwitz I, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Klauberg injected caustic substances into the uteri of Jewish and Romani women in an attempt to find a rapid and inexpensive method of mass sterilization. SS Sturmbannführer Horst Schumann irradiated the genitals of men and women with X-rays in pursuit of the same result by another route. The altitude and hypothermia experiments, carried out also in other camps with Auschwitz prisoners as subjects, sought information about the physiological limits of the human body under wartime conditions. The subjects died during the experiments or were executed afterward, so there would be no witnesses. In 1946, the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, the first of the 12 proceedings after the main trial, articulated for the first time in international law the principles that should govern medical experimentation on human beings: voluntary consent, real scientific necessity, the possibility of withdrawal. All those principles had been systematically violated at Auschwitz. Several camp doctors were sentenced to death and executed. Mengele escaped to South America and drowned in Brazil in 1979, never having been tried. While the doctors experimented and the crematoria operated, Auschwitz also had a third dimension that often remains in the background. It was a vast economic enterprise. The warehouses that prisoners called Canada, by association with the idea of a distant and prosperous country, were the visible heart of that economy. There arrived the belongings confiscated from deportees: suitcases, clothing, shoes, kitchen utensils, musical instruments, toys, jewelry, money, photographs, books, dentures, orthopedic prostheses, glasses, everything a family had considered essential for a new life, and which, upon arrival at the platform, immediately became the property of the Reich. The prisoners forced to work in the Canada warehouses lived in a particular kind of torment, surrounded by objects that belonged to people who had died or were about to die, surrounded by the material trace of destroyed lives, the smell of the clothes, the family photo in the pocket of a coat, a child's name embroidered into a coat. Every object was evidence of a specific person who had existed. Some prisoners used their access to the warehouses to obtain hidden food among the belongings: biscuits, chocolate, stale bread that deportees had brought, believing they would need it for the journey. For those who found such remnants in a coat hem or at the bottom of a bag, it was a treasure whose value would have seemed ridiculous outside. The gold extracted from the teeth of corpses, by Himmler's order from September 1940 onward, was sent to the SS Medical Service. By early 1944, between 10 and 12 kilograms of gold were being extracted monthly from that source. The women's hair, cut after death at Auschwitz, unlike in other camps where it was cut beforehand, was washed in saline solution, dried, and packed for shipment to German textile factories, where it was made into carpets and mattress stuffing. When the Red Army arrived in January 1945, it found 7 tons of human hair ready for shipment. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben had chosen in 1941 a site 7 kilometers from the main camp to build a synthetic rubber factory. The reason was simple. The concentration camp offered virtually free labor. IG Farben paid the SS between 3 and 4 Reichsmarks for each prisoner's work shift. The prisoners themselves received nothing, except a ration level that was just sufficient to keep them functioning as labor power, with no concern whatsoever for their long-term survival. The camp built at Monowitz to house IG Farben workers, Auschwitz III, was the first concentration camp financed and built by private industry. Between 1943 and 1944, approximately 35,000 prisoners worked at the plant. Of them, 23,000 died from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. An average of 32 deaths a day. When a prisoner died or became too weak to continue working, he was replaced by a new one from the main camp. SS administrators constantly threatened the prisoners with the gas chamber. The smell of the Birkenau crematoria reached Monowitz depending on the direction of the wind, as a permanent reminder of what awaited those who ceased to be useful. Alongside IG Farben, other German companies established their own subcamps around the Auschwitz complex. Krupp, Siemens Schuckert. The Holocaust was not only a moral tragedy, It was also a business. Many of the corporations that took part in it continued to exist after the war. Some still exist today. Daily life in the camp for prisoners who were not exterminated on the platform was designed, though designed is almost too soft a word, to keep the body exactly on the edge between functionality and collapse. Wake-up came between 4 and 5:30 in the morning depending on the season, with a metallic gong and the shouts of barracks supervisors. In the next minutes, bodies that had not truly rested in weeks or months tried to dress with hands that no longer obeyed them, to put on wooden clogs that were often the wrong size, to complete basic bodily needs in latrines, where time was limited and space insufficient for thousands suffering chronic diarrhea caused by malnutrition and contaminated water. Roll call, the appel, could last from minutes to many hours. Prisoners stood in rows of 10 in the yard, whatever the weather, rain, snow, frost, summer heat. If the number did not match because someone had died during the night, fallen ill, or tried to escape, the roll call began again. On the 6th of July 1940, when a Polish prisoner managed to escape, roll call lasted 19 hours. The prisoners remained in the yard all through the night and for most of the next day. Anyone who collapsed was forced to get up. Anyone who could not was beaten. Anyone who still could not get up after the beating was dragged away. The workday lasted 11 hours. Much of the labor took place outdoors: construction, quarries, farms, loading and unloading. In the winter months, the Polish cold could drop to 20 degrees below zero, and the striped cloth uniforms provided no real protection. No gloves, no proper underwear, often shoes worn to the point that the soles came apart. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, described in his book Man's Search for Meaning how in those conditions, a piece of wire found on the ground to tie a shoe could determine whether a prisoner survived the following week, because an unprotected foot in the Polish cold developed ulcers in days, and ulcers led to infections, and infections led to selection for the gas chamber. The food was calculated to produce exactly that: a sustained caloric deficit that would consume the body gradually and predictably. Later medical studies established that the Auschwitz diet represented between 1,300 and 1,700 calories a day for men performing intense physical labor for 11 hours. The basic caloric requirement of a man under those conditions is approximately 3,500 to 4,000 calories. The body covered the deficit by consuming its own reserves, first fat, then muscle. The result, documented in the photographs the Red Army took upon liberating the camp, was skeletons with skin, sunken faces, huge eyes in faces where the fat had disappeared. Historian Peter Hay calculated that in the Monowitz camp, prisoners were reduced to that state within 3 to 4 months. At the center of that routine of physical destruction was food, or more precisely, what the camp called food. The first issue of the day was a hot, dark drink, a coffee substitute made from roasted barley or chicory that gave almost nothing to the body but whose temperature had an immediate effect. It loosened stiff muscles, gave the brief illusion that something was entering. That illusion vanished within minutes. Then came appel, and during appel, the body kept emptying out. At midday came the soup. The word soup was almost a joke inside the camp, because what was served was often hot water stained with minimal remnants of cabbage, turnip, or potato peels so fragmented they looked like an accident in the liquid. Prisoners learned to read the soup with obsessive attention. If the surface was clear, it was a worse day. If a faint film of grease floated on top, it was slightly less bad. If a solid piece appeared that could actually be chewed, it was an event. That difference, invisible to anyone who had not experienced extreme hunger, could mean 1 more hour of strength, a little less dizziness when bending down, a minimal extra ability to keep walking by the end of the afternoon. The soup line was a scene of permanent tension. Prisoners advanced with their containers pressed against their chests, protecting them as if they were vital organs, because in a sense they were. No container meant no soup, and no soup meant the body lost its only caloric intake at midday. Mud was a constant enemy. One misjudged shove could overturn the bowl. When that happened, some knelt and tried to gather from the ground whatever they could, mixed with mud and dirt, because mud humiliated less than emptiness. Bread came at the end of the day, and with it came the hardest decision of the entire day. The ration was a piece of dark, dense bread, sometimes sour, often from the day before. The body demanded eating it all at once. But eating it all meant waking at 3 in the morning with a savage emptiness and nothing to face it with until the following morning. Saving it was strategy. And strategy brought its own suffering. Sleeping with food meant sleeping with fear of theft. In the darkness of the barracks, with bodies packed centimeters apart, a hand could move like an animal in the night. Many prisoners developed rituals of guarding. They wrapped the portion in a piece of cloth and tied it with specific knots to detect whether anyone had undone them. They hid it under loose boards in the bunks, in folds of clothing, in any crack that could function as an improvised safe. Some slept with a hand resting on the bundle, as if physical contact could keep it from disappearing. Fear of theft was not paranoia. It was accumulated experience. Hunger drove people to the limits, and at the limits they did things they would never have imagined themselves doing. The robbed prisoner lost his reserve and moved closer to the edge. The camp produced that conflict deliberately. Food was also economy. Bread was the camp's currency. It was traded for needles, thread, buttons, information, favors that could mean the difference between a less deadly work assignment and a more exposed one. Some broke the bread into tiny fractions to stretch out time, chewing one crumb, waiting, chewing another. It was not satiation. It was the management of pain. Some saved a crumb for dawn as a psychological gesture, to begin the day with something, however little. The camp had created a new scale of value in which a crumb could be an event, in which a piece of crust was a resource to be carefully planned. Night brought relative relief that was not rest. The 3-tier wooden bunks often held 4 people in a space designed for 1. In the worst moments of overcrowding, they held more. Prisoners slept pressed together, sharing scarce body heat because there was no other source of warmth. They slept in the clothes they wore, the only clothes they had, and with their shoes under their bodies to prevent theft during the night, because losing one's shoes could mean death. This entire structure, hunger, cold, exhaustion, punishment, constant surveillance, was designed for a purpose beyond immediate cruelty. It was designed to eliminate the possibility of organized resistance. A body permanently struggling to stay alive has no energy for anything else. A mind whose horizon has been reduced to the next ration cannot plan beyond the day. The system generated its own mechanism of control by internalizing exhaustion, and yet resistance existed. It was small in proportion to the scale of the system, and that disproportion says something about how effective the system was. But it existed, and it deserves to be told precisely. The first documented escape attempt occurred on the 6th of July, 1940, barely 3 weeks after the arrival of the first mass transport. Tadeusz Wiałowski managed to get out of the camp. He was later captured and executed, but the system's reprisal went beyond him. Roll call that night lasted 19 hours. After that escape, Höss implemented collective reprisal as policy. When someone escaped, a group of prisoners from the fugitives' barracks was selected at random and sent to starve to death in the cells of Block 11. That practice turned every prisoner into the implicit guardian of the others, because one man's escape could mean the death of 10. Despite that, the attempts did not stop. On the 20th of June, 1942, 4 Polish prisoners carried out an escape with the audacity of a cinematic plan. One of them, Kazimierz Pieczowski, had gained access to a warehouse where SS uniforms were stored. 3 of the 4 dressed in guard uniforms. They took a camp car and drove out through the main gate with the 4th companion presented as a detainee to be transferred. The guards saluted them. The car left. All 4 survived the war. From exile, they sent Höss a letter ironically apologizing for the loss of the vehicle. On the 21st of July 1944, Jerzy Bilecki, a Polish prisoner who had spent more than 4 years in the camp, walked through the gate wearing an SS uniform with his Jewish girlfriend, Syla Cybulska, whom he presented as a detainee to be interrogated outside the camp. The guard did not question the papers. Both survived. Yad Vashem later recognized Bilecki as righteous among the nations. But the escape with the most important historical consequences occurred on the 7th of April, 1944. Rudolf Verba, serial number 44070, and Alfred Wetzler, number 29162, escaped to Slovakia by hiding for 3 days in a prearranged hiding place near the outer perimeter, covered with tobacco mixed with gasoline to mislead the dogs. When they came out, they carried with them not only their bodies but something of incalculable value. Detailed and precise knowledge of how Auschwitz worked, of the gas chambers, of the crematoria, of the mechanisms of extermination. And they had the determination to make that knowledge reach the world. The report Vrba and Wetzler prepared after arriving in Slovakia, known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report, was the first document to describe with technical precision the functioning of Auschwitz's extermination facilities. It included dimensions of the crematoria, estimated extermination capacities, descriptions of the selection process, names of those responsible, details of the methods of deception used on deportees. The report first circulated among the Jewish communities of Slovakia and Hungary, then reached Allied governments and the Vatican. Its distribution contributed to the decision of Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy to temporarily suspend deportations from Hungary in July 1944. That pause, late and incomplete, may have saved tens of thousands of lives. The Auschwitz Protocols, the set of reports from various escapees that included the Vrba-Wetzler report, were published in full in November 1944 by the United States War Refugee Board. By then, most of the Hungarian Jews deported to Auschwitz had already been murdered. The information had arrived. It had not arrived in time. The question of why the Allies did not bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz or the crematoria themselves remains one of the most painful historical debates about the Holocaust. Allied military officials argued that the precision bombing required to destroy specific installations without killing prisoners demanded resources that could not be diverted from the main war effort. Other historians have pointed out that Allied bombers flew over the region several times in 1944, photographing nearby industrial facilities, and that the crematoria were perfectly visible in those photographs, yet no one at the time chose to examine them for that purpose. The decision not to bomb, or not even to attempt it, was a political and bureaucratic decision, not a technical impossibility. The most extraordinary act of resistance inside the camp took place on the 7th of October 1944. The members of the Sonderkommando of Crematorium 4 rose up against the system that forced them to operate it. The Sonderkommando was one of the darkest aspects of Auschwitz's design. A group of prisoners, mostly Jews, forced under threat of immediate death to work in the crematoria. They removed bodies from the gas chambers, extracted valuables, cut the hair of dead women, transported the bodies to the furnaces, collected the ashes, crushed the bone fragments that had not burned completely. They knew exactly what was happening. In many cases, they had seen their own families enter the chambers they operated, and they knew that sooner or later they would be replaced by a new Sonderkommando in order to eliminate the witnesses. The rotation was systematic. When a group of Sonderkommando members knew too much, when they had operated the system long enough to describe it accurately, they were liquidated and replaced. It was a witness elimination mechanism built into the extermination process itself. The system killed those who killed for the system. This circular logic, which turned victims into instruments of their own extermination and of the destruction of the traces of that extermination, represented one of the most calculated aspects of Auschwitz's design. When word came that 300 of them were to be transferred, they understood what it meant. The group marked for transfer, composed mainly of Greek and Hungarian Jews, decided that dying while resisting was different from dying while waiting. They attacked the SS guards with stones, hammers, and tools. They killed 3 guards and wounded several more. They set Crematorium 4 on fire with rags soaked in oil and gasoline. The crematorium burned. In Crematorium 2, hearing the explosions, another Sonderkommando group assumed the revolt had spread across the entire camp. They threw their capo into one of the burning furnaces and cut the electrified wire with pliers they had hidden weeks earlier. They fled toward the nearby woods. The SS crushed the uprising within hours. They surrounded the barn where the fugitives had taken refuge and set it on fire. When the count was over, 451 Sonderkommando members had been killed. The remaining 212 lived only a few more months before being eliminated. Crematorium.V never operated again. Before the uprising, some Sonderkommando members had found their own way to resist. By documenting, Salmen Gradowski, one of those killed in the uprising, had buried his notebooks written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3. They were found after the war, when another survivor indicated where to dig. Published decades later under the title From the Heart of Hell, their pages describe what Gradowski saw and lived through over months with a precision and intensity that make them one of the most extraordinary testimonies to extermination that exist. Another Sonderkommando member, whose identity remains unknown, produced, with charcoal and under impossible conditions, a series of drawings now known as the Auschwitz sketchbook. 22 illustrations showing the entire process. The deportees descending from the train, the platform, the gas chambers, the furnaces. They are not the drawings of a trained artist. They are the drawings of a witness who knew he was going to die and wanted the world to know what he had seen. While these acts of clandestine documentation were taking place inside the camp, Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army was carrying out since 1940 an intelligence operation of exceptional audacity. He had deliberately allowed himself to be arrested in Warsaw in order to be deported to Auschwitz, with the goal of organizing a resistance network from inside and sending information outside. Under the alias Tomasz Serafiński and serial number 4859, Pilecki spent 2.5 years in the camp, built a clandestine network, and regularly sent reports on the conditions and the extermination underway. He escaped on the 27th of April 1943. His second report estimated that 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, had been murdered at Auschwitz. The Polish government in exile distributed that information among the Allies. The responses came late, inadequately, or did not come at all. In the autumn of 1944, with the Red Army advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing deeper into Europe after the Normandy landings, the SS began to face the evidence that the war was lost. What followed was a methodical attempt to erase, not only to empty the camp, but to eliminate the proof of what had happened there. Sonderkommando members were forced to exhume the mass graves where victims of the first months had been buried, back when the pace of extermination did not yet justify full cremation, and to burn the remains on open-air pyres. After burning the remains, many of those same Sonderkommando members were executed. The gas chambers were shut down. Zyklon B stopped arriving. On the 17th of January 1945, the SS recorded the last prisoner number at Auschwitz. Engelbert Markiewicz, a German criminal transferred from Mauthausen, received number 202,499. He was the last. The next day, the evacuation began. Approximately 58,000 detainees were forced to march west on foot, in the middle of the Polish winter, with temperatures on some days falling to 20 degrees below zero. The columns moved along snow-covered roads. The prisoners wore their rags of uniform, without proper winter gear, without physical reserves for the effort. Those who fell behind were executed on the spot. The SS detachments following the columns shot without ceremony anyone who could not keep up. Historian Peter Longerich estimated that between 1/5 and 1/4 of the deportees died during those death marches, which lasted days and weeks toward camps farther west that the Red Army would take longer to reach. On January 20, the SS blew up crematoria 2 and 3 at Birkenau to destroy evidence. On January 23, the warehouses called Canada, where the belongings confiscated from deportees had been piled up, were set on fire. They burned for 5 days. Crematorium V was destroyed on January 26, one day before the Red Army arrived. On the 27th of January 1945, a soldier from the 100th Rifle Division of the Red Army entered Auschwitz III, the IG Farben camp at Monowitz. Other units of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front reached Auschwitz I and Birkenau at around 3 in the afternoon. What they found left many of them without words for what they had seen. They found 7,000 living prisoners in the 3 main camps. They found more than 600 corpses. They found 837,000 items of women's clothing, 370,000 men's suits, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7,000 kilograms of human hair, packed in bags and ready to be sent to textile factories in Germany. Hair the SS had cut from corpses before feeding them into the furnaces. Hair washed in ammonium salt solution, dried, and packaged as raw material. When the Red Army found it, it had not yet been shipped. Soviet Colonel Georgy Elisavetsky entered one of the barracks and tried speaking to the survivors in Russian, in Polish, in German, in Ukrainian. Silence. Then he tried Yiddish. He said he was Jewish. He said they had come to free them. According to his account, that was the moment when something changed. As if an inner barrier collapsed all at once, the survivors began to move. They crawled toward the soldiers. They knelt. They kissed the lapels of their coats. Primo Levi was in the camp infirmary, recovering from scarlet fever, which, paradoxically, had saved his life because it had left him too weak to be included in the death marches. He described the arrival of the first 4 soldiers on horseback as a moment he would never forget. They cast looks, he wrote, that he recognized. A shame he too knew, the guilt of someone who is confronted with something too vast and too dark to fit into the picture of the world he thought he knew. It was the shame that such a crime had existed, that it had entered irrevocably into the world of things that are. The reckoning that followed was necessary, late, and incomplete. Rudolf Höss was arrested by the British on the 11th of March, 1946, near Flensburg, where he had been living under a false identity, working as a farmer under the name Franz Lang. He was taken to Nuremberg to testify in the trial of SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner. His statements on the extermination process, delivered with a calm that unsettled even experienced prosecutors, became key evidence in establishing how the Nazi extermination system functioned. He was extradited to Poland, where the Supreme National Tribunal tried him in the very place where he had committed his crimes. On the 2nd of April 1947, Höss was sentenced to death. On April 16, he was hanged at Auschwitz I, a few meters from the crematorium where the first Zyklon B experiments had taken place in 1941. The gallows were installed specifically in front of that building. It was a deliberate gesture. The place of execution was made to correspond to the place of the crime. At the Auschwitz trials held in Krakow that same year, the Polish Supreme National Tribunal prosecuted 40 former members of the camp staff. 23 were sentenced to death, 7 to life imprisonment. Among those executed were the women's camp commandant Maria Mandl and Commandant Arthur Liebehenschel, Höss's successor during one period of his tenure. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, held between December 1963 and August 1965, took almost 20 years to take place. They lasted 180 days of hearings. 21 of the 22 defendants were convicted, though the sentences were unsatisfactory for many survivors. Only 6 life sentences. The others received terms of between 3 and 10 years. Several of the accused had spent the years before the trial living entirely normal lives in post-war Germany. They had jobs, families, neighbors who did not know or did not want to know. Of the approximately 6,335 SS personnel who worked at Auschwitz over the course of its existence, no more than 789, less than 15%, were ever prosecuted. 85% never answered before any court for what they had done. The final numbers of extermination were calculated rigorously by historian František Pijper in a study published by Yad Vashem in 1991 and still considered the most accepted reference. Of the at least 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, between 1,940 and 1,945, at least 1.1 million were murdered. Approximately 960,000 of them were Jews, and of that group, 865,000 were gassed directly after arrival without ever being registered as prisoners. The remaining dead included 74,000 ethnic Poles, 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and between 10,000 and 15,000 citizens of other nationalities. The country with the highest number of victims was Hungary, with 430,000 dead, followed by Poland with 300,000, France with 69,000, and the Netherlands with 60,000. 1 out of every 6 Jews murdered in the Holocaust died at Auschwitz. In 1947, the Polish government passed the law establishing the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum on the site of Camps I and II. In 1979, UNESCO inscribed the site on the World Heritage List. January 27 was designated by the United Nations General Assembly as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, in memory of the date of liberation. The survivors who lived long enough to speak and write left behind a body of testimony that remains one of the most important sources for the history of the 20th century. Primo Levi published If This Is a Man in 1947. Viktor Frankl published Man's Search for Meaning that same year. Elie Wiesel published Night in 1958. Edith Eger survived Auschwitz and became a clinical psychologist, publishing her memoirs decades later. Simone Weil, who would go on to become president of the European Parliament, was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Each of them articulated, in his or her own way, the same question that still remains: what it means to know what we know now. Not as a catalogue of past horrors, but as active knowledge about what human beings are capable of doing and how they do it. In 2018, a survey commissioned by the Claims Conference found that 41% of the American adults surveyed did not know what Auschwitz was. 22% said they had never heard of the Holocaust. Among young adults between 18 and 34, the percentages were worse, forgetting advances. The generation of direct witnesses disappears. Each year there are fewer people in the world who can say, "I was there and I saw." What remains, when the witnesses are gone, are the documents, the blueprints signed by Bischoff, the technical letters from Top Función about furnace efficiency, the protocols of the Wannsee Conference, IG Farben files on the cost-benefit logic of slave labor, the notebooks of Salmin Gradowski buried next to the crematorium, the drawings of the anonymous witness who knew he was going to die and drew what he saw because the alternative was that no one would know. And there is the material evidence. Archaeologists who have worked at Auschwitz-Birkenau using subsurface survey techniques that do not require excavation, preserving the integrity of the site, have located foundations of structures, drainage systems, remains of building materials. They have found personal objects left behind when everything else was destroyed. Wedding rings, coins, buckles, fragments of eyeglasses, children's toys. Each of those objects is a material statement against the attempt at erasure undertaken by the SS in the last months of the war. The Nazis destroyed the crematoria. They burned the archives. They leveled the ground. They planted trees. They tried to make the place look again like a clearing in the woods, where nothing had happened. They did not completely succeed. What remained? The buildings that survived, the objects that were buried, the testimonies of those who escaped, the documents that never reached the flames, became the proof that the destruction was not total, that the project of erasing every trace failed. The most important reason to know in detail how Auschwitz was designed and built is not the accumulation of historical facts, it is to understand the sequence. Because the sequence reveals something the simplified story of the exceptional monster hides. Auschwitz was the result of a gradual process in which each step seemed, to those taking it, only one more step. It began with laws that separated one group of people from the rest. It continued with propaganda that dehumanized them. It moved on to concentration, expulsion, escalating violence. At every stage, those responsible could tell themselves that what they were doing was legal, necessary, justified. At every stage, those watching could tell themselves that what they were seeing was temporary, exaggerated, not as serious as it looked. And at every stage, the next step became possible because the previous one had been accepted. At the end of that chain of steps, there was an engineer in Erfurt drawing blueprints for crematoria. There was a chemist in Munich calculating the lethal dosage of a gas. There was a doctor on the Birkenau platform pointing his thumb to the right or to the left. There was an SS officer in a stucco house 100 meters from the camp playing with his children in the garden in the afternoons. There were officials in private companies writing letters to camp administrators about the price per prisoner and delivery conditions. There were executives calculating the return on investment of a factory built on slave labor. And there were, in the towns and villages surrounding the complex, people who saw the smoke, smelled the odor, heard the trains passing at night loaded with people who did not return. People who chose not to ask, or who asked and received answers they decided to accept without examining too closely. Passive complicity, chosen silence, the privilege of looking away when what lies on the other side is too uncomfortable. That too was a decision. Repeated millions of times across Europe during the years Auschwitz operated. None of them would have defined themselves as monsters. Many did not think they were evil. They thought they were doing their job. And that is exactly what makes Auschwitz not only the largest site of death in the 20th century, but also its most urgent warning. That the most destructive machinery in history was not built by exceptional beings. It was built by ordinary people who chose, at every point of decision, to continue. The blueprint exists. The signature is in the archive. The record of the experiment is dated. The contract with the company is preserved. All of it exists, and all of it proves that Auschwitz was not a natural phenomenon, was not inevitable, was not the work of fate. It was a project, and projects are made by people. People who, at the time, chose to make it. That is the only reason why it matters to know how it was built.